At 8:15 a.m., her front door knob jerked and clattered as though a desperate stranger on the other side wouldn't take no for an answer. She stood paralyzed in her living room, barely breathing. What she did next would save her life, and she knew she only had seconds to decide. Malora Rivera had never thought of herself as the kind of woman who courted danger. In fact, she craved solitude, that comforting hush of being alone with her thoughts. At 30 years old, Malora had come to Venice, California, seeking a fresh start after an especially turbulent chapter in her life, one marked by heartbreak, financial uncertainty, and a gnawing restlessness she couldn't quite name. Some nights, she'd tell herself that fleeing her old apartment was nothing more than a spontaneous leap of faith. Other nights, she sensed it was survival. She worked freelance as a digital designer, which allowed her to plug in her laptop wherever she pleased. When she found the listing for a small loft apartment on the outskirts of Venice, something about the place called to her. Perhaps it was the promise of palm trees swaying in the warm breeze, or maybe the bohemian charm of the area. Either way, she packed her life into a few cardboard boxes, said goodbye to the echoes of her past, and moved into the loft without looking back. From the outside, the building wasn't much to look at. A flat, sand-colored structure on a lonely street where neighbors seemed more like passing ghosts than friendly faces. Yet it offered something Malora yearned for: silence. Her loft sat on the top floor, accessible by a narrow set of outdoor stairs. Inside, the living space was modest, with a cozy couch pressed against a wall and a kitchen so small it was almost comical. A ladder led up to the mezzanine-level bedroom, where the ceiling sloped low, forming an intimate alcove she could call her sanctuary. During the first few days, the hush blanketing her new home felt like a welcome respite. The only visitors she noticed were the occasional seagulls that soared overhead, their cries echoing against the late afternoon sky. She'd sit at her desk by the window, tapping away at her design projects, pausing every so often to stare at the palm trees lining the distant street. The breeze carried a mix of sea salt and car exhaust, a distinctly Californian aroma that made her feel both alive and oddly nostalgic. Yet, almost from the start, little things seemed off-kilter. At night, Malora would hear faint creaks, like old floorboards settling beneath the weight of invisible footsteps. Initially, she dismissed these sounds as nothing more than the building's normal groans. After all, older structures made all kinds of noises. Still, an unshakable feeling of being watched nagged at her. She'd catch herself glancing over her shoulder while she brushed her teeth or pausing mid-step on the ladder to listen to the silence. But each time, she willed herself to ignore the prickling at the back of her neck. It was just her mind playing tricks, she reasoned. She was in a new environment, feeling a little tense, totally normal. Walking down the street one afternoon to grab groceries, she first saw him. A hunched figure stood at the corner, wearing a threadbare jacket despite the warm sun. The man's eyes followed her with an intensity that sent an icy jolt through her chest. He mumbled something inaudible, words slurring in a tone that teetered between anger and despair. Malora quickened her pace, heart thudding. But as soon as she turned to look again, he was gone, vanishing behind a row of unkempt bushes near a bus stop. She tried to brush it off, telling herself Venice was known for its diverse population, including many struggling souls on the streets. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that he had singled her out somehow, marking her presence in a way that left her unsettled. It wasn't just the man on the corner, though. Passing strangers often seemed distant, as if tethered to their own realities, offering neither warmth nor curiosity. She'd grown accustomed to city life, the anonymity, the casual disinterest of neighbors. But there was something about this particular stretch of road that felt decidedly unfriendly. Each building loomed like a silent observer, windows dark, doorsteps empty. At times, the hush was so complete that even distant traffic noise vanished, leaving only the whisper of her shoes scuffing the sidewalk. On the morning everything changed, Malora awakened with an inexplicable sense of heaviness. Perhaps she'd slept poorly, or maybe it was just the lingering stress of settling into a new place. Slivers of sunlight cut through the blinds, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stale air. The digital clock by her bed read 8:03. She usually woke earlier to get started on her design work, but today, a dull exhaustion kept her pinned to the mattress longer than usual. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling her mind drift, only half aware of the unearthly quiet surrounding her. Silence. It was too quiet, as though the world outside had pressed the mute button. Where were the gulls she'd grown used to hearing at dawn? The soft rumble of distant cars? Even the distant hum of neighbors moving about their daily routines seemed to have disappeared. A faint unease threaded through her belly, prompting her to get up. She pulled on a worn gray sweater and shuffled into the tiny kitchen, half expecting to see a note on the floor or a door left ajar. Anything that would validate the sense of wrongness gnawing at her. But everything was as she'd left it the night before. Pots stacked neatly, a single mug resting in the sink. She stood there a minute, letting her gaze wander over the small space, her ears straining for a clue. Nothing. It was as though the entire neighborhood still slept, and that sense of absolute stillness somehow amplified her own heartbeat. With a shaky exhale, Malora decided she was simply overthinking it. She hadn't had enough rest, and her nerves were on edge. Maybe she just needed coffee. But even as she turned toward the kettle, she couldn't shake a single, lingering question. Why did this morning feel so wrong? And if no one else was around to witness it, was she truly safe behind her locked door? She was about to find out. At precisely 8:15 a.m., a sound shattered the eerie stillness that had been clinging to the loft like a shroud. It started as a soft click, as though someone were gently testing the door handle from the outside. Malora's entire body tensed, her stomach knotting. The handle rattled again, this time more forcefully, sending a small quake through the door. She felt certain, beyond any lingering doubt, that whoever was on the other side was more than just a curious neighbor. There was an air of desperation behind the motion, an urgency that spoke of ill intent. Her breath caught in her throat. She could almost sense eyes boring through the thin barrier, scanning for movement. Every instinct told her, stay quiet, stay hidden. Heart pounding, she eased her phone off the counter, the screen glaring bright in the morning light. No messages, no missed calls. Nobody was supposed to visit, especially not at this hour. There was no explanation for the steady, insistent turning of her doorknob. Trying to steady her trembling hands, Malora crept toward the window. The loft's small living area made stealth nearly impossible. Every footstep on the hardwood floor felt thunderous. She pressed her back against the wall, inching her way to the glass pane, careful not to cast a visible shadow. Slowly, she nudged aside the curtain with a single finger. Through the haze of adrenaline, she glimpsed a figure pacing back and forth on the sidewalk below. A man, barely more than a silhouette, muttered to himself, his words lost in the distance. Though she couldn't make out his features, something about the frantic way he moved, the irregular turn of his head, struck her as deeply unsettling. From her vantage point, she saw him pause. He looked up at her apartment as if sensing her silent observation. Panic surged in her chest. Could he see her? She froze, holding her breath. For a moment, he simply stood there, one hand dangling at his side, the other occasionally lifting to brush against the building's exterior. Then, as abruptly as he'd appeared, he wandered off, disappearing around the corner. Malora exhaled a shaky breath, bracing herself against the wall. Maybe it was just a random stranger passing by. Venice had its share of troubled drifters, after all. Still, the thought did little to ease the knot in her stomach. Clutching her phone, she glanced at the time. 8:18 a.m. She waited, straining her ears for any further noises, but the loft had returned to a maddening hush. In the quiet, her pulse thundered. She considered calling the police right then. Yet, a lingering doubt told her she might be overreacting. After all, the man was gone now, wasn't he? Steeling herself, Malora moved away from the window, footsteps soft against the wooden floor. She tried to focus on practicalities. Maybe she should boil water for coffee, calm her nerves. Maybe she should text a friend and mention the weird encounter, just in case. 15 minutes of tense silence crawled by. She had just opened the kitchen cupboard to retrieve her mug when the terror returned, more violent this time. It began with a low thud at the door, then another, each blow heavier than the last. The door rattled as if someone were repeatedly throwing their weight against it. Bang, bang. The vibrations traveled through the floor, reverberating up her legs. Malora's heart hammered in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she felt paralyzed by a sudden wave of dread. She realized in a flash that the stranger had returned, and he wasn't just testing the lock this time. He was trying to break in. The thought crashed into her like a tidal wave of cold fear. Dropping the mug in the sink with a clatter, she spun toward the front of the loft. The door visibly shuddered under each impact. She caught a glimpse of the flimsy chain lock rattling, threatening to snap at any moment. Struggling to keep her breath steady, she fumbled with her phone again, thumb pressing the emergency call shortcut. A ring. Another ring. Then, silence. The line went dead for a moment, as though the signal had been swallowed by the building's thick walls or some technological glitch. Panic constricted her throat. She tried again, this time hearing a distant operator's voice crackle. Relief flickered, but it was short-lived. The connection wavered, cutting in and out. Address? Hello? Ma'am, can you? Then static. Her frustration and fear spiked. This was no time for a phone malfunction. She pressed her back into the wall, gaze frantically darting between her phone's screen and the door. Another punishing thud made the entire frame quiver. Come on, she hissed through clenched teeth, trying the call again. She managed to choke out her location and situation before the line dropped once more. There was no immediate reassurance from the dispatcher, only a cold, empty silence that resonated with the pounding in her ears. She needed a plan. The door, already showing splinters near the handle, wasn't going to hold much longer. She could practically hear the breath of the intruder on the other side, ragged and impatient. She swallowed hard, recalling every self-defense tip she'd ever read. Make noise. Flee if you can. Defend yourself as a last resort. But the loft had limited exits. The front door was obviously compromised. The windows? There was one near the bed on the mezzanine. Could she climb down somehow? Her mind raced through the options. Stay put and try to barricade the door? The intruder was already too determined. She doubted a makeshift barricade would keep him out for long. Confront him? The idea was laughable. She was unarmed, and he was clearly willing to use force. That left escape as her best bet. Yes, the window in the loft. But it was a dangerous drop onto the lower roof, and from there, an even steeper descent to the ground. Yet, the alternative, waiting here to meet whoever was on the other side of that door, felt far worse. Another crash reverberated through the loft, and she let out a small, involuntary cry. He's not stopping. Any second now, the lock would give way. She had to move. Tightening her grip on her phone, Malora dashed across the living area, every muscle screaming at her to hurry. She slipped on the first rung of the ladder up to her bedroom, heart drumming at a near-deafening pace. Steadying herself, she climbed. She could already see the lines forming on the door's surface below, wood bending under pressure. Reaching the mezzanine, she scrambled toward the window, one that led to a tiny ledge often used for maintenance. Her hands shook so badly that she could barely grip the latch. She managed to force it open, pushing the glass outward. A gust of morning air rushed in, tinged with salt and distant pollution. It felt strangely exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. She glanced back over her shoulder to see the door downstairs buckling. A splinter cracked off, hitting the floor. The intruder was almost through. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Some fragmented voicemail or text? She couldn't tell. There was no time to check. Survival. That was all that mattered now. She tossed one leg over the windowsill, hesitating at the yawning space below. If she fell, she could be seriously injured. Yet the sight of the door disintegrating made her blood run cold. There was no real choice here. Gritting her teeth, she hoisted herself out. The outside ledge was narrow and unsteady under her weight, forcing her to inch forward on her stomach. Her breath came in short gasps, and the ladder leading to the rooftop above was just a few feet away. But each inch might as well have been a mile. She swallowed, summoning her courage. Inside the loft, she heard a final splintering crash. The door had given way. Her mind whirled. He's inside now. Every heartbeat reverberated through her trembling limbs. Somehow, she managed to reach the edge of the roof, hauling herself up by hooking an elbow over the gutter. With one last burst of strength, she pulled her body onto the flat, tarred surface. In the faint reflection of the morning sun, she could see dust swirling where she'd dislodged bits of debris. She heard footsteps below, the staccato thump of someone moving around in the loft. Though the rooftop provided a momentary escape, she realized with renewed horror she was still trapped. She could be cornered if he decided to climb after her. And a sickening thought emerged. What if that's exactly what he plans to do? She pressed herself flat against the roof, every nerve on edge, her phone clutched tightly in one hand. She didn't know if the police had heard her clearly, or if anyone was even en route. All she knew was that each second counted, and her next decision could mean the difference between life and a nightmare she didn't dare to imagine. The moment Malora hoisted herself onto the roof, she realized that being out in the open brought its own set of terrors. Gone was the illusion of solid walls and a locked door, thin though they might have been, between her and the intruder. Now, she crouched behind the shallow ridge of the rooftop, her pulse roaring in her ears. The warm California sun had not yet reached its peak, but already the dark tar beneath her hands felt hot, filling the air with an oily scent that churned her stomach. She sucked in a trembling breath, mentally retracing her steps from the loft to this precarious perch. Breaking the window latch had proven more difficult than expected. Her palms were slick with sweat and her fingers shook, as though every muscle had rebelled against her desire to escape. When the latch refused to budge, she'd been forced to kick at the thin sheet of plastic screening until it tore loose, leaving jagged edges that scratched at her legs as she climbed through. She'd felt a rush of mixed triumph and terror the instant her body slipped outside. But that triumph lasted only seconds. The crash of her bedroom door yielding to brute force pierced the air behind her, echoing in the small loft. She risked one backward glance and saw the intruder stepping through the ruined doorway, his eyes sweeping the room. Her heart lurched as she realized he'd see the open window in seconds. When she pulled herself fully onto the roof, her lungs burned from exertion. Now, every nerve urged her to keep moving, to find another way down, maybe to a neighboring rooftop or a fire escape. But she hesitated, scanning the rooftop's edge for some kind of ladder or an adjacent structure to jump to. The building next door stood several feet away, forming a narrow gap of open space that looked too far to leap without risking a deadly plunge. She inched along the rooftop's ledge, crouched low, praying for any stroke of luck. Below, the streets remained strangely empty, the hush punctuated only by distant car engines or the squawking of seagulls. Where were the neighbors? Didn't anyone see or hear the commotion? Tension coiled in her gut. Maybe they heard and didn't want to get involved. Maybe no one else was awake yet. Venice could be eerily quiet on certain mornings, when the usual throng of tourists hadn't appeared, and locals were locked away behind closed doors. She pressed her body flat against the low parapet. If she were lucky, he might think she'd fled entirely, and he'd focus on searching inside the loft. But that hope died the instant her ears caught a muffled scrape from the window's frame, followed by a grunt of exertion. Her blood ran cold as she realized he had climbed out too. At first, she thought she might be imagining it. Her own worst fears conjured into a hallucination. But then came the unmistakable crunch of gravel or tar underfoot. Step by step, the intruder was edging his way onto the roof. Malora felt her heart twist. He couldn't possibly know she was up here unless he'd seen her slip out, or discovered the broken screen and quickly deduced her escape route. Either way, he was close. Close enough that she could sense his presence in the air, like a static charge preceding a lightning strike. She dared a peek over her shoulder. That was when she saw him in full daylight for the first time. A wiry man, mid-20s at most, hair greasy and wild. His eyes, ringed with a manic intensity, darted across the rooftop. He muttered incoherently under his breath, the words tangling into a low snarl that sent a chill rippling through her. He scanned the area, turning in a slow circle until his gaze nearly swept over her position. Malora sank lower, pressing into the warm tar, forcing her breath to come shallow and quiet. The edge of the roof offered only the barest cover, no more than a couple of inches of raised concrete. She wondered if he could sense her fear, if some primal radar told him she was near. In that moment, all the survival tips she'd ever read blurred into static. Fight or flee. She was pinned, overshadowed by the intruder's next move. If she tried to run now, he'd see her immediately. But if she stayed put, he might close in, cornering her without mercy. Suddenly, his voice cut through the silence, low and dripping with menace. "I know you're here somewhere." She flinched. The words, though quietly spoken, carried an unmistakable threat. She dared not even blink. Her phone, still in her hand, offered no salvation. She had already called the police. If they were coming, but who knew how long it would take for them to arrive? The intruder edged closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Each step felt like a countdown to her discovery. His eyes flicked over the rooftop's corners, the unremarkable vents, the battered air conditioning unit. Then he shifted his gaze downward, scanning the ledges. Malora realized with stark clarity that if she stayed in place, it was only a matter of time before he spotted her. The angle of the sun threatened to cast a telltale shadow she wouldn't be able to hide. Her mind raced, adrenaline surging in a painful spike. No more waiting, she decided. She needed a distraction, anything that might buy her a few precious seconds. Carefully, she patted the ground around her. Her fingers found a small chunk of broken roofing, maybe part of a damaged tile. She couldn't see it clearly, but it felt solid in her grip. Her pulse hammered. If she tossed it across the roof, would it clatter loudly enough to misdirect him? She steeled herself, counting silently. 1, 2. On 3, she pitched the piece of debris as far as she could manage, angling it so it would land behind the intruder. It struck the rooftop with a soft thud, then rolled before coming to rest, producing just enough noise to make his head snap in that direction. He took a quick step, tension rippling through his frame. She could almost imagine him snarling, angry at being fooled. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Malora used his momentary distraction to crawl a few feet along the edge, inching closer to an old metal pipe that jutted from the roof surface. It offered no real shelter, but at least it broke up her silhouette. Her legs trembled, and each time she moved, her jeans scraped loudly against the tar. She winced at every sound. There was no guarantee the intruder wouldn't spot her or return to the window for a different vantage point. A clatter jolted her attention back to him. He'd picked up a loose piece of metal from somewhere near the rooftop's HVAC unit, a rod or a broken pipe. She wasn't sure. He brandished it like a weapon, eyes darting with an unsettling mix of glee and rage. The swirl of unpredictability in his expression made her insides twist. He wasn't just looking to corner her. He was prepared to hurt her. One step, then another. He moved closer to her position. Malora's mouth went dry. Any illusions that she might be able to reason or plead with him evaporated at the sight of his agitation. She needed an immediate plan. The rooftop didn't offer many escape routes. No second ladder, no connecting building close enough to jump to. She peered over the edge at the alley below, gauging the distance. A leap from this height could easily break a leg or worse. Her gaze shot back to the intruder, and a terrible realization dawned. He was scanning the perimeter again, methodically. When he circled around the far side, he might catch her in the open. Time was up. Desperation galvanized her. She spotted a small metal toolbox near the edge, likely left by a maintenance worker. If she could get to it, maybe she could use something inside as a makeshift weapon. But it was a gamble. The intruder was just a few yards away. If he caught her mid-dash, there'd be no second chance. She pressed her lips together and risked it. In a sudden burst, she lunged from her hiding spot, heart pounding like a drum. The intruder whipped around. Their eyes locked, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Malora to see the mania swirling in his dark pupils. He lunged at her, brandishing the rod. She felt a scream claw at her throat, but no sound escaped. She launched herself forward, hand outstretched, straining to reach the toolbox. At the same instant, her foot caught on a small seam in the tar, sending her stumbling. She gasped, flailing to keep her balance. The intruder took that as his chance, raising the makeshift weapon high. Melora's mind went blank with raw terror. She managed to twist away, hurling her phone at him in a desperate move. He jerked aside, momentarily off balance, as the phone grazed his shoulder and fell with a clatter. It wasn't much, but it slowed him just enough. Without pausing, she kicked a loose piece of metal lying near her. With a clank, it slid into the intruder's path. His foot landed on it, slipping awkwardly. He reeled, arms windmilling, nearly toppling over the edge. For a wild heartbeat, Malora thought he might go over. But he regained his footing, letting out a strangled sound that was half scream, half laugh. Fury blazed in his eyes as he steadied himself, rod still in hand. A shout rang out from somewhere below. Someone on the street, seeing two figures wrestling on the rooftop. "Hey!" echoed faintly, followed by indistinct yelling. Melora's stomach lurched with a flutter of hope. A witness. Someone had seen them. The intruder's gaze snapped downward. She seized the moment, scrambling back toward the parapet. As she peered over, she could just make out a person on the sidewalk, frantically gesturing at passing cars. Though she couldn't hear clearly, it seemed they were shouting about calling the police. Relief surged, an electric current running through her veins. But the intruder spat a hateful snarl, as though the very idea of help arriving enraged him further. He turned to Malora once more, grip tightening around his makeshift weapon. This time, there was no confusion in his expression, only intent. She realized with chilling clarity that if the police didn't get here fast, she might not live to see them. Her only option was to keep him at bay, to force another misstep that might give her a chance to dart away, or for a rescuer to reach her first. "Stay back," she croaked, voice trembling. It was a pitiful warning, barely above a whisper, but it was all she could muster. The intruder bared his teeth in a grotesque parody of a grin. Behind him, the sun caught the edge of the metal rod, reflecting a dazzling light that blinded her for a moment. She shielded her eyes. In that fraction of a second, he lunged yet again. She had no choice. Summoning every ounce of courage and strength left in her, Malora braced herself for one more desperate move. The intruder lunged for her once more, metal rod poised like a weapon. Malora braced herself, raising an arm defensively, knowing full well her odds of stopping him on her own were slim to none. Every muscle in her body coiled, awaiting the impact. But in that split second before he could strike, a thunderous voice echoed from below. "Police! Drop the weapon!" The intruder hesitated, his wild eyes snapping toward the street. Malora didn't risk looking down. She was too aware of the precarious balance they both maintained atop the roof. But she heard more shouts, commands barking through the tense air. A wave of relief and terror surged in her veins. The police had arrived, but would they reach her in time? "Drop it now!" Another voice roared, growing closer. She dared a quick glance downward. Two officers had positioned themselves in the narrow alley, weapons drawn, while a third rushed to the side of the building, retrieving a portable ladder from the trunk of a patrol car. The intruder hissed a furious snarl, the rod trembling in his clenched fist. Then, in a reckless move, he pivoted to the rooftop's edge, scanning for a way down that didn't involve surrender. Malora was shaking so hard she could barely stand. Part of her wanted to collapse on the spot, to give in to the terror and exhaustion that had been eating away at her all morning. But she couldn't, not yet. She clung to the shallow lip of the roof, conscious that any sudden movement might still provoke him. Within moments, the third officer's head appeared over the roofline. He hoisted himself up, shouting at the intruder to stand down. The man whirled, brandishing the rod as if daring anyone to approach. Malora found herself pinned between the officer and the intruder, not quite sure which direction to move. She swallowed hard, trying to edge away. "Stay still, ma'am. We'll get you down," the officer ordered, his voice rigid with focus. Torn between flight and utter panic, Malora edged closer to the ladder. She watched the officer step forward, weapon at the ready, as two more officers emerged behind him. They repeated their commands, drop the weapon, hands in the air. But the intruder only sneered, lips curling into a twisted, mocking grin. He shuffled backward, as if weighing his chances of a sudden leap across the gap to the next building. Malora's gaze darted between the cops and the intruder, wondering if he would really try something so suicidal. Her chest tightened. If he did leap, she might get caught in the chaos. Then, with disorienting speed, he whirled on her, flinging out a hand. She barely registered what was happening before she felt his fingers close around her forearm, nails biting into her skin. He hauled her toward him in a savage yank, and she cried out, twisting in an attempt to break free. Several officers shouted in alarm. One lunged forward to grab Malora's other arm, pulling her away from the intruder's grip. She felt her body jerk sideways, nearly toppling off the roof. Her heart thudded as she clung to the ladder's edge, nails scraping against cold metal. Two officers converged on the intruder, tackling him in a rush of limbs and grappling arms. He howled, an inhuman sound that echoed across the rooftops. Even as they pinned him face down, he continued to struggle, feet kicking at the air. Malora caught a final glimpse of his expression. Eyes dilated with a wild combination of fury and something else, dark satisfaction, perhaps. Then they cuffed him, pressing him against the sun-baked tar. A bitter laugh sputtered from his throat, sending a chill through her. "Come on, ma'am," urged one of the officers, guiding her firmly onto the ladder. Her legs wobbled so badly she could hardly descend. Every rung seemed to sway beneath her weight, but the officer held a steadying hand on her shoulder. At last, her foot touched solid ground, and her knees buckled. A paramedic who'd just arrived rushed to her side, helping her stay upright. Above them, the intruder let out a final cackle as the officers tightened the cuffs around his wrists. That sound, almost gleeful, lodged itself in Malora's mind, replaying with an unsettling echo. Even in defeat, he seemed to relish the fear he'd caused. They brought him down moments later. The police had to physically drag him backward along the ladder, his body thrashing in resistance. Once on the pavement, he continued to struggle, forcing the officers to shove him into the back of a squad car. Yet throughout it all, his twisted grin remained. Malora sank onto the curb, hugging herself, trying to catch her breath. For a few moments, she couldn't manage more than shallow, gasping sobs. An officer knelt beside her, offering a bottle of water. She drank mechanically, her mind still raw with shock. How did you get here so fast?" she asked, voice trembling. The officer explained that a passerby on the street had seen two silhouettes on the roof, one apparently wielding a weapon. Multiple calls had come in within minutes, including her own faint, interrupted 911 plea. They arrived ready for a hostage scenario, fully prepared for the worst. Malora nodded, relief mingling with a renewed wave of shakiness. In the hours that followed, she sat wrapped in a thin blanket on the back of an ambulance, watching the scene play out. Police combed through her loft, taking photos of the splintered door and scattered belongings. One detective approached her with a grave expression. "We've arrested him before," the detective said quietly. "He's known to stalk women in the area. Always slips through the system because of mental health issues and lack of evidence." The words burrowed under her skin. A short while later, another officer came by, informing her of something even more disturbing. They suspected the same man might have been involved in a prior break-in at her apartment, months before she moved in. They'd found markings on the windows, partial prints on the frames. It suggested he'd been scouting the property for a while, possibly entering it when no one was there. Malora's heart twisted. She realized that her sleepless nights, her strange sense of being watched, none of it had been mere paranoia. It was as though she'd wandered into a place laced with hidden dangers, all culminating in this morning's terror. Later, after giving her statement, Malora returned to her loft. Stepping through the splintered doorway sent a shiver up her spine. A part of her wanted to pack a suitcase right then and never look back, but exhaustion weighed her down, making every movement a monumental effort. Eventually, she began to straighten up in a daze, picking up fallen books, shreds of wood, and shattered glass. That was when she noticed it. A single sheet of paper lying on her kitchen counter, slightly crumpled at the edges as if it had been handled more than once. A few words scrawled in shaky handwriting. "You escaped this time, but I always know where you are." Her throat constricted, pulse pounding in her ears. The message felt like a cold hand wrapping around her spine. She glanced frantically around the loft, imagining every dark corner as a potential hiding place. Had he managed to slip in at some earlier point? Left this note as a twisted warning? That ominous question hovered, refusing to fade. How long had he been inside her home? Standing there, the final fragments of daylight glinting through the ruined window, Malora realized with sickening certainty that the horror wasn't over. The intruder was in custody, for now, but the threat felt uncomfortably alive, seeping into her very walls. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she wondered if she would ever truly feel safe again.